Dear all, this is Chandramouli, your project management consultant. In this video, we will discuss the stakeholder classification model. Stakeholders, as we know, are those members or entities who are actively involved in project execution, or whose interests may be positively or negatively affected by project outcomes. 1. Stakeholder interests may be either positively or negatively impacted by the project. 2. Alternatively, stakeholders may influence project execution and project results. 3. It is important for project planners to identify all stakeholders and their requirements. 4. Sometimes, individual stakeholder requirements may be implicit and not explicitly stated. 5. Stakeholders may have conflicting interests and objectives. 6. Involving stakeholders in the initiation phase group improves the probability of a positive outcome for the project. 7. In general, differences among stakeholders must be resolved in favor of the customer or end user. Every project has stakeholders who are impacted by or can impact the project in a positive or negative way. Some stakeholders may have a limited ability to influence the project's work or outcomes, others may have significant influence on the project and its expected outcomes. The ability of the project manager and team to correctly identify and engage all stakeholders in an appropriate way can mean the difference between project success and failure. To increase the chances of success, the process of stakeholder identification and engagement should commence as soon as possible. After the project charter has been approved, the project manager has been assigned, and the team begins to form. Now, let's look into the way in which stakeholders can be classified. Type 1, stakeholders, can be classified as internal stakeholder and external stakeholder. Type 2, stakeholders, can be classified based on impact, influence, power and interest. Type 3, stakeholders, can be classified based on upward, downward, outward and sideward, or any other classification model. Power is the level of authority of the stakeholder. Interest is the level of concern of the stakeholder. Influence is the level of involvement of the stakeholder. Impact is the effect of involvement of the stakeholder. After completing the stakeholder identification, you will classify them. To classify stakeholders, the following questions are being asked. 1. What is the power of the stakeholder? 2. How much influence do they have on the project? 3. What is the interest level of the stakeholder? 4. How much do they desire to be involved with the project? Once we get the answers to these questions, we can classify the stakeholders. Some of the most popular classification models are: 1. Power and interest grid. 2. Power and influence grid. 3. Influence and impact grid. 4. Power, urgency, and legitimacy grid. Power is the level of authority of the stakeholder. Interest is the level of concern of the stakeholder. Power and interest grid. In this type of classification, you group the stakeholders according to their power and level of interest in the project or its outcome. You can give them the following attributes: high power or low power, high interest or low interest. Power is the level of authority of the stakeholder. Influence is the level of involvement of the stakeholder. Power and influence grid. Here, stakeholders are grouped according to their power and level of influence on the project or its outcome. In this type of classification, you can give stakeholders the following attributes: high power or low power, high interest or low interest. Influence is the level of involvement of the stakeholder. Impact is the effect of involvement of the stakeholder. Influence and impact grid. This classification is based on the influence and impact of the stakeholders on the project or its outcome. You can give stakeholders the following attributes: high influence or low influence, high impact or low impact. Power, urgency, and legitimacy. This model is also known as the salience model. Unlike other classification models, this model uses 3 parameters to classify project stakeholders. Here, stakeholders are classified as per their power, urgency, and legitimacy. You give the following attributes to stakeholders: core, dominant, dangerous, dependent, latent, discretionary, and demanding. You have identified the project stakeholders and classified them, and you know who is a more powerful and influential stakeholder, and who is not. So, now, you can develop strategy to focus on the powerful and influential stakeholders. This will help to win their active support, and can save energy by focusing less on the low power and low influential stakeholders. The stakeholder classification models help in dealing with the different stakeholders. For example, in the case of power interest grid, the following cases are possible. 1. A stakeholder with high power and high interest should be managed with utmost care. 2. A stakeholder with high power and low interest should be kept satisfied. 3. A stakeholder with low power and high interest should be kept informed. 4. A stakeholder with low power and low interest require less effort than the rest. They should only be monitored. As a project manager, it is your job to keep looking at each stakeholder and their requirements, because you never know when a low-power stakeholder will become one who is high power and influential. Likewise, a powerful stakeholder may become less powerful in a later stage of the project. The purpose of a stakeholder engagement strategy is to increase the support and minimize the negative impacts of the stakeholders. It is very important for you to understand the communication needs of your stakeholders. Communicating regularly with them will ensure that they understand the project's requirements and they feel connected to the project. The stakeholder management plan may contain sensitive information which cannot be shared with everyone. Therefore, keep this document in a secure place. Summary: stakeholder identification, stakeholder classification, and stakeholder management are the processes which should be performed in the early stages of the project, because they help to shape the project and win support from the stakeholders. The project management is all about managing stakeholder requirements, and if you failed to do so, your project will not have a successful ending. You should start building trusting relationships with the stakeholders from the beginning of the project. Wish you all the best. Thank you very much for watching this video.